Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Manitoba Alumni and Friends Virtual Learning for Life program. My name is Tracy Bowman. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations here at the University of Manitoba and a very proud alumna. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you for joining us and for making this event part of your day. We are able to offer this program free to all of our alumni and friends thanks to the very generous sponsorship of our affinity partner, IA Financial Group. Many thanks to them. You can also learn more about the insurance options they offer alumni, also on our alumni website. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping details. Today's session is being recorded as we have in the past with our other Virtual Learning for Life programs, and will be posted to our website in the next day or two, so you're able to watch it as many times as you want, as well as share with friends and colleagues. I encourage you to check out all of our other previous lectures on a wide variety of topics from over the past 18 months, also on our website. You were also sent a link to Slido and a password, and that is the platform. If you haven't joined us with us before, that's the platform we use, so you're able to ask your questions of the speaker. And so that website is www.slido.com, and the password is VLFL3. I moderate that, and so you can post your questions throughout the discussion, and then we will be able to ask them at the end of the presentation. We will try to get through as many as we can. So I do encourage you to ask your questions. So now I'm delighted to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Melanie Soderstrom, on the topic of talking to tiny people, the role of infant-directed speech in early language development. Now, let me share a little bit about her. Dr. Soderstrom is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology. She is currently on the governing board of ManyBabies, a large-scale collaborative research initiative in infant experimental science. Melanie's research focuses on understanding how infants' perceptual skills interact with their everyday experiences, with speech sounds to support the process of first language development. In non-pandemic times, she directs the Baby Language Lab, a behavioral laboratory that conducts experimental research on infants' responses to speech. And she's also the lead investigator of ACLEW, which is an international and interdisciplinary project building tools and data sets to examine infants' real-world language experiences. So with that, over to you, Dr. Soderstrom.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you today about my research. Before we begin, I do need to take one very quick moment to acknowledge that I am a member of the University of Manitoba Faculty Association, which is currently on strike against the administration. I'm able to come and speak with you today despite this because I'm on research study leave, and therefore I'm not technically on strike. However, because of the nature of this meeting, I did obtain permission from UMFA before coming to you today. So I have permission to cross the picket line. Okay, so have you ever been told, don't talk baby, talk to your baby? You might have heard this from a friend or a relative or maybe even a health professional. The goal of this talk is to convince you that this is not necessarily the best parenting advice. In the course of this talk, I'm first going to take a little bit of time to talk about what I mean by that, and I'll use the term infant-directed speech, which is the more formal term that we use for baby talk. I'm first going to present some experimental research that I'm involved in, looking at infants' preference for listening to infant-directed speech. And then secondly, I'll talk about some more observational research that I'm involved in that's looking at infants' real-world experiences with language in a cross-cultural context. And along the way, I'm going to share with you some what I consider to be really exciting methodological advances and to discuss those advances. And this involves large-scale collaborative research models, as well as new technologies that we're using in our research. So what is infant-directed speech? I'm going to play for you a couple clips, and hopefully this works. The first clip is going to be a mother talking to an experimenter, an adult experimenter, about some objects. And then the second clip will be that those, actually several mothers, and then some other mothers talking with their infants about those same objects.
Different ball, it's slightly bigger, but squishy in the same way. It's just a blue kind of basketball. So it's good for mixing. Reflects the light pretty nice. It has little divots in it with trucks all over it, and then Velcro. It's a big shoe.
Okay, and here's the same objects or similar objects speaking to an infant. Oops. Oh no. What have I done here? There we go. Where's my mouse? There we go.
I'm gonna grab that part. Here we go. Do you want to hold the handle? Look at that. What do you think? Can we roll the ball? Yeah, you can put it on your head like a hat. It's got white stars. There's 50 of them. Good job eating the shoe.
Okay, so hopefully you noticed a few differences in the way that we talk to adults and the way that we talk to infants. I will just highlight a couple of them for you today. One of them is that we tend to use a very different pitch, so higher pitch, more exaggerated intonation or melody. And this is a characteristic that has the tendency to draw infants' attention to the speech that you're producing, and this is helpful for getting them to pay attention to speech in order to learn language. The second thing that you might have noticed is that we tend to use shorter and more simpler words and utterances, which makes the speech easier for infants and young children to understand what they're hearing as they're breaking into a new language. And finally, you may have noticed that there's lengthened syllables and a lot of longer pauses between utterances, and this can give infants time to process the information that they're hearing. So before we go any further, I want to clarify that there's actually two different things that we're talking about when we say infant-directed speech. So the one definition is sort of infant-directed speech as a style of speaking or a register, and that's how I've been talking about it so far. There's actually a different way of thinking about infant-directed speech, which is just simply, regardless of what the characteristics of the speech are, who's being talked to. And we have research also that infant-directed speech is helpful in this way, in the sense that responsive caregiving and these interactive one-on-one conversations between a caregiver and an infant are really important for language development as well. The other thing I'll say about terminology is that I will tend to go back and forth between child-directed speech and infant-directed speech. There are some changes as infants get older and how we talk to them, but those can be considered interchangeably for our purposes. I'll also occasionally refer to target child-directed speech, and this is just to differentiate that one-on-one sort of talking to an infant versus talking in an infant-directed way, perhaps to another child in the environment. Okay, so what is the evidence that infant-directed speech is good for language development? Well, we actually have a good 50 years of evidence supporting this now. So we know that infant-directed speech is widespread across quite a diverse set of communities around the world. And just the fact that it's so widespread is in itself an indication that this is not something that's a problem, right? Furthermore, we have good theoretical reasons, as I was explaining in a previous slide, that some of these characteristics could actually be beneficial. But we actually have good concrete evidence that it is providing benefits. So for example, we know that from a variety of studies that have found that infants prefer to listen to infant-directed speech over adult-directed speech. And more recently, we actually have even more direct evidence that exposure to infant-directed speech in not adult-directed speech leads to faster language development. And this has been found both in the laboratory and in more ecological settings. Okay, so if we have 50 years of evidence supporting this, why am I conducting research on it today? Well, there are some good reasons to revisit our understanding of infant-directed speech. And the first two I'll focus on in the first part of my talk, and then the last one will be the motivation for the second part of my talk. So the first reason is that our research is what is called WEERD. And WEERD with one E is a term that was coined about 10 years ago by Heinrich et al. It stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And it simply refers to the fact that there's a bias in the populations that we study and the researchers who do that research which creates a cultural bias in our understanding of psychological and behavioral phenomena. The reason that I add an extra E in there is that when we're studying language, and especially when we're studying language development, there's quite an English bias where a good 50%, for example, of the research in my research community on language learning tends to come from North America. And this is particularly problematic when we think about study of infant-directed speech, because it's fairly well understood that North American English infant-directed speech, the characteristics of it are relatively extreme compared to even some similar languages like German or French. So this does sort of create some questions about how generalizable our findings are. Another slide that this is not my research, this is Schneidman and Goldenmeadow, but I think it really nicely illustrates why it's important to think about this outside of our North American context. So this is a study that compared the amount of speech that American infants were hearing compared to Mayan infants. And you can see that they're hearing very similar amounts of speech in terms of what they overhear between adults or between adults and other children. But the speech that they hear directed directly at them, there's about a 10-fold difference between what the American babies were hearing and what the Mayan babies were hearing. And what's important to understand about these findings is that there's no indication that Mayan infants are in any way disadvantaged by not having very much directed speech. To the extent that we can compare across languages, infants in these environments appear to meet language milestones at roughly the same rates as infants in environments where there's a lot of infant-directed speech. So it creates quite a paradox in our understanding of what the role really is. And that's what I'm interested in learning more about. The other reason to revisit our findings is something that you may or may not be familiar with, and this could be a whole talk into itself, so I'm going to really just skim the surface here. But the issue is that there's been concern about the extent to which psychological findings are replicable, the extent to which one study can find the same thing as another study, and that we can know that our findings are really truly legitimate. And there's a number of reasons for this. One has to do with the fact that studies have traditionally had very small sample sizes, especially in infancy research where it's so hard to recruit participants. There's also reasons related to certain questionable statistical practices that are becoming less common, but takes some time to work your way through those practices in the field. There's another issue that's relatively specific to infancy research, which is that there's quite a lot of methodological variation across laboratories. Because testing infants is hard and each laboratory kind of comes up with its own way of doing it. And so when one study fails to replicate from a laboratory to another laboratory, we often don't know why it failed to replicate. It may have something to do with the different ways that infants are being tested in these different laboratories. And finally, replications themselves, actually going to the effort to replicate a study, is much more rare than it ought to be. And the reason for a lot of these problems has to do with what we refer to as perverse incentives in our research, which is that scientists tend to be rewarded for the flashy novel finding and don't get rewarded for the important labor that's necessary to really establish that a finding is real and generalizable. So within our research community, we have a new large-scale project that I've been thankful to be heavily involved in called ManyBabies. So ManyBabies is a large-scale collaborative experimental research effort with infants. Our goal is to replicate some of the important findings in infancy research with large amounts of laboratories and large numbers of babies. It functions in a radically collaborative, consensus-based framework, so we really try not to have too much sort of top-down direction, but really get a lot of input from a large number of researchers. We also have the goal of developing experimental best practices in infancy, so we study our methods and try and figure out what's working well and what's not working well. And finally, we're interested in increasing the diversity of our researchers, our populations, and also our research questions. So luckily for me and for us, the first study that was ever conducted by ManyBabies was ManyBabies 1, which was a study of the infant preference for infant-directed speech. And unlike some other research within our field, there was actually an existing meta-analysis of infant-directed speech. So if you're not familiar with that term, it just means that researchers have taken the findings of studies around the world from different published studies and combined them together to kind of get one research result out of it. And this meta-analysis told us that there was an effect and measured that effect. It also suggested that there was no age effect, which means that infants' preference for infant-directed speech didn't change across development. So what methods did we have in this large-scale test of infant-directed speech? Well, the first one was called the head-turn preference procedure. And that's on the left-hand side here. You can see an adult sitting in the chair. You'll have to imagine that there's a baby sitting in their lap. The angle won't permit us to see that the baby's there. The infant looks at the screen where there's a circle or a flashing light to get them looking forward. When they look forward, one of the screens to the side turns on, and the infant usually looks to the side. When they do that, we play the speech sound. So in this case, it would be either infant-directed speech or adult-directed speech. And then we measure their interest in what they're listening to based on how long they continue to look towards the screen where the sound is coming from. The second method is somewhat similar. It's called central fixation, and it's still relying on measuring whether the baby's looking at the screen, but in this case, the baby is simply looking forward at the screen in the front. So it doesn't rely on a head turn and is therefore good for babies that are a little bit younger and may not have control of their head turns at that point. And then the final method is called eye tracking, and it's very similar to central fixation with the single screen, except rather than having a human experimenter who was usually located in another room indicating whether the infant is looking at the screen or not, it's done in an automated way through eye tracking technology. Okay, so what were the speech sounds that we were actually measuring their interest in? Well, you've actually already heard them. Those were the clips that I played you at the beginning of the talk. But just as a reminder, these were clips that were created by mothers speaking to their young infants and to an experimenter, and they simply pulled objects one at a time out of a bag. They were labeled, and they simply talked about the objects to the infant and to the experimenter. Okay, so the final sample in ManyBabies 1 had 69 laboratories contributing data. 76 were able to be included in the final sample, representing 17 countries around the world. And this was very exciting and the largest by far study of its kind. But you can see we were hoping to get some really good coverage around the world, and in some respects we did that. But you can also see there's quite some gray areas in our representation within this first ManyBabies study. The final sample was over 2,000 infant participants, which is about 2 orders of magnitude higher than a typical infant study, just to give you some context. And the ages of the infants ranged from 3 months up until 15 months. Okay, so the first question we were interested in was, do infants prefer infant-directed speech? And if they do they like it a lot or a little? So here's the first slide that I'll show you, and it's quite busy, so I promise I'll talk you through it. So first here on the left-hand side, you can see the list of all of the laboratories that contributed. And for each row along here is a set of data from a given laboratory. You can also see that there's the 0 dotted line here, and this is indicating when there's no effect. So no preference for either infant-directed speech or adult-directed speech. Dots to the right of that line are indicating preference for infant-directed speech, so our expected effect. Dots to the left of the line indicate an overall preference for adult-directed speech. So a couple things to note here. First of all, you can see that there's a general shifting over toward the right, indicating that infants on average do prefer to listen to infant-directed speech. However, you'll notice that there's also some dots to the left of that 0 line. And what that means is that if those laboratories had been running this test on their own without doing this in the context of this large-scale replication project, they might have reported that the infants didn't prefer the infant-directed speech, or perhaps even that they preferred the adult-directed speech. So this is a really good indication of why it's important to do these kinds of large-scale replications. Okay, so did infants prefer infant-directed speech? They sure did. However, the effect size as we measured it was smaller than what was found in the literature with the meta-analysis. And I can talk to you in question period about why we think that might be. We also asked whether the preference varied by infant age. Does it change across development? And does experience with North American English matter? So here we broke up the study. This is the same data, just presented in a different way. You can see on the left-hand side here are the North American English babies. On the right-hand side, you can see the non-North American English babies. So this right-hand side here is quite a grab bag of babies with different kinds of experiences, just to be clear. On the bottom is the mean age of the infants from 3 up until 15 months. And this time we have effect size on the y-axis here. So higher means more preference for infant-directed speech. So as you can see, both for the North American English infants and the non-North American English infants, there was a preference that grew over age, a developmental change with increasing preference from 3 to 15 months for infant-directed speech. Additionally, a little bit harder to see, but we did find an effect where there was greater preference for the North American English infants than for the non-North American English infants. Unfortunately, because of the nature of our design of this particular study, we don't know whether that was greater familiarity with the language that we were testing in, because all of the babies were tested in English, or because of a difference where North American babies might overall have a stronger preference for infant-directed speech. And that's something that we're following up with in some additional studies. So this is just summarizing what I said. There's a preference that grows from 3 to 15 months and a stronger preference within the North American sample. So finally, we looked at a methodological question: does testing method actually affect our ability to measure this preference? And here I'll return you to that original slide, and hopefully you can see that the blue dots here are a little bit more shifted to the right than the other two. So we actually did find that there was a stronger effect for the head turn preference procedure over the other two methods. And we don't know exactly why this is, but we suspect that it has to do with the fact that the head turn procedure involves an explicit head turn on the part of the infants, which requires them to make a more sort of explicit behavioral response, and therefore may be more sensitive to their actual preferences. Okay, so what was the impact of this research? So first of all, our central goal was to establish the IDS preference effect in a much larger and more diverse sample than we had done in the past, and so we were able to accomplish that. Because of the large sample, we're also able to look at a lot of different factors, both methodological and other behavioral factors that might influence the size of the preference effect. And importantly, also, because it was the first study of its kind, it was a proof of concept for testing more controversial findings. So we didn't exactly have a lot of researchers who were expecting to see that there was no preference for infant-directed speech. It, as I said, had been pretty well established already. But it set up the possibility of doing this kind of research with more controversial findings. So we have a number of follow-up studies of ManyBabies 1 itself. We also have empirical studies looking at other conceptual findings. And we have a number of methodological projects that we're working on as well, including, as you can see here, ManyBabies Africa, which is a work in progress to build relationships with research collaborators in various places in Africa in order to extend the scope of the generalizability of our findings and the reach of our diverse samples. Okay, so before I turn to the next topic, I just want to reflect briefly on the benefits of this new approach, because this really is a novel way of conducting research for infancy researchers. So the most important thing, I think, is that it improves our research practice, in part because it avoids perverse incentives, and also because it allows us to study our methods and to understand what works and what doesn't. Related to this, it's been very helpful in building a research community around these issues and these methods. And in fact, we got a fair amount of nice feedback from early career researchers who were just setting up their own research laboratories, that it was incredibly helpful to have a study like that they could participate in, where they had this nice research community to really support them in developing a good laboratory with good protocols and methods. Thirdly, research of this type is very well vetted. As I said, with this collaborative approach, you get many very awesome minds thinking about the same things and ensuring that the study is the best design that it could possibly be. And lastly, it allows us to ask research questions that might otherwise be out of reach. So for example, if you want to study infants who are born early, that's a population that's quite hard to test for a number of reasons. It can be very challenging to get a big enough sample size to ask a question about preterm infants. And if you combine forces with a number of laboratories in different places, you can actually build up a much larger sample and make those kinds of studies that are really important studies much more practical. Of course, there are challenges and downsides to collaborative research. The biggest one that we've run into so far, unfortunately, is funding. The funding mechanisms are, at the current time, not well set up for this kind of research. They're really well designed for individual laboratories working in their own little silos. And this is especially important because one of the goals of ManyBabies is to create a more diverse population under study. We really need to be able to provide funding to under-resourced laboratories around the world. And this is very challenging to do if we don't have funding that allows us to do that. Another challenge with this kind of research is how to attribute credit and establish authorship for a project that involves up to 150 or more authors all participating on the same project. This is something that has been worked out in other research fields, but it's very novel to infant psychological research, and it creates a lot of interesting questions about how to indicate credit and authorship. And finally, the collaborative decision-making process, while I think it is really beneficial in terms of the robustness and the quality of the research that we do, is of course a challenge in and of itself, but in my opinion, well worth the effort. Okay, so I said that there were 3 reasons to revisit infant-directed speech, and so far I've only talked about 2 of them. The second has to do with the extent to which the findings and the things that we say about infant-directed speech are truly relevant to infants' real-world experiences. And this is often referred to as ecological validity. So far we've established that, at least in the laboratory, infants like to hear infant-directed speech. But that doesn't really tell us whether infants are actually hearing infant-directed speech in the real world, or what that looks like, or how much it's an important part of their everyday experiences. So this isn't something that people have not realized up until now, but in the past, we've only really been able to think about this in very sort of short clips. So for example, people would do very short 1-hour recordings of mothers interacting with their infants, usually in a somewhat contrived, sit on the floor and play with your infant setting, which is perhaps not truly representative of the real world experiences of infants who go about their lives. They go to the grocery store, they visit a relative, or they sit on the floor while the mother does the laundry, right? So we really want to know what infants are actually hearing in their everyday lives. And this was a big challenge up until about 15 years ago, when a new method was developed called long-form audio recording. And that's just a fancy way of saying that we collect long recordings of infants that from the moment they wake up until the moment they go to sleep. These can be really good long, full day recordings of their daily experiences. And so there's an audio recorder that just goes into a pocket of some clothing or a vest and is worn by the child as they go about their whole life. And so this part of it, the hardware part of it, is maybe a nice technological advance, but what's truly changed the methodological approach is the software component of it. So what Lena did, Lena was really the pioneer in this work, and it emerged on the stage about 15 years ago. Is that it would do automated speech processing on the recording signal. So here you can see an illustration of that. The blue on the bottom there is in the back rather, is the waveform, the actual audio, raw audio. And then Lena would classify the chunks of the recording into pauses where there's no speech, and detect the parts where there's speech. It would then analyze that speech and assign chunks of speech into particular speaker categories like male adult, female adult, other child, target child. And then from there, it does even further processing where it can give you estimates of the amount of speech, adult speech and other types of speech the infants are hearing. So this was really helpful in starting to think about what the kind of audioscape was of infants' daily experiences with language. But there was a big limitation to Lena, which is that it doesn't differentiate child-directed speech and adult-directed speech. And obviously that's something that I would consider very important for my research. So I collaborated with a few other laboratories in North America. And what we did was we took existing recordings that we each had in our laboratories. We combined them together. And we actually used Lena for the first part of our processing. So we randomly sampled within those audio recordings about a little over 1,000 conversations over the total sample. And from those, selected only the parts of the conversation that were labeled by Lena as being adult speech. Okay. And then we took those, so each of those was a little audio clip. And then we took those audio clips and fed them to human annotators and simply asked them to classify, was it a male speaker, a female speaker, and were they addressing an infant or an adult or another adult in the room? And we also had a third classification of junk for anything that Lena had misclassified, because Lena's classifications aren't perfect, they're estimates. So this left us with a final sample of a little under 10,000 clips of audio that we had labeled by our human speakers. And we asked a few different research questions. I'll present two of them today. The first was, are there differences according to caregiver gender? So are infants hearing different things from female adults and male adults? And also, does exposure to child-directed speech vary by child age? Is there a developmental change? So here is one illustration of the data that we were able to generate. So the green on the top is speech from women, and the blue on the bottom is speech from men. And so as you can see, there's more speech from women than from men. That's probably not a surprise, even though we're supposedly in a gender-neutral society. The other thing that may be a little harder to see is that we didn't see a developmental change. So there did not appear in this method of measuring to be a change in the raw quantity of child-directed speech that infants were hearing. However, if we look proportionally, the picture looks a little bit different. So here, in terms of the proportion of child-directed speech over a total amount of speech, you see that there is a shift towards more child-directed speech as the children got older. And the reason for this is that what we're seeing in the sample was a decrease in the amount of adult-directed speech as the children get older. And this was a bit of an unexpected finding for us. So we only have some sort of post hoc explanations that we can generate for this. One thing that we think might be going on is that as children get older, they're more likely to be put down and potentially kind of crawl away from the speakers, the adult speakers. And so therefore adult conversations may occur a little bit further away from infants as the infants get older. Okay, so are there differences according to gender? Yes, we did see significantly more speech from female caregivers in our North American sample. And does exposure to child-directed speech vary by child age? It does, but in this case, only in proportion. It's not changing in terms of raw quantity of speech. Okay, so far though, these results are only with respect to North American infants. And we really did want to extend our findings to really think about this in a more global context. The other thing that was going on at the same time was that we were realizing that there were some downsides to Lena. Lena's been incredibly influential in a really, in my opinion, very positive way for the research community in how it's changed how we think about studying infants' experiences, but there are some downsides to it. So it's very expensive, proprietary software. It's also in these kinds of things rather old, so it's about 15 years old now, which in speech technology terms is quite outdated. Also, there are some known inaccuracies in Lena's estimates, particularly with respect to its measuring of male speech and other children. And as I've already explained, there's some missing functionality. So particularly, we really want to be able to study separately adult-directed speech and child-directed speech. And we'd also really like to be able to differentiate between different languages that infants are hearing. Particularly, this would be very useful for bilingual infants, for example, and getting a handle on the relative ratios of the amount of speech they're hearing in different languages. So with all of this in mind, we formed a slightly more formal collaborative which we refer to as a CLUE, which is analyzing child language experiences around the world. We like to have snappy acronyms. And a CLUE really had 3 goals. One was to build an annotation system that would be appropriate for these long form audios, which really didn't exist up until then. And another was to actually build some automated speech processing tools in collaboration with some speech technologists. But the part that I'll focus on today is simply the building of the cross-cultural data set, which we refer to as a metacorpus because it was a combination of a number of different corpora of audio recordings that had been developed in different laboratories. So our CLUE metacorpus was large by the terms of what's been established in the past, but is still relatively modest compared to what we would like to do. We have some North American samples. We have a sample from the UK. We also have a sample from Buenos Aires, including both very low and middle SES families. And we also, importantly, thanks to a collaborator, Midi Casillas, have 2 non-WEERD communities in our sample. And importantly, they're not identical to each other, right? So one thing I didn't say at the beginning of the talk, this notion of WEERD and non-WEERD is sort of this weird binary that doesn't really mean anything. It's just a way of indicating that we have bias in our research. So the Mayan sample is similar but not identical to the Mayan sample that I referred to earlier in the talk. We also have a sample from Papua New Guinea that is very similar in terms of its sort of economic and community structure, but differs from the Mayan sample in that their perspectives on caregiving are a little bit more similar to North American perspectives than the Mayan sample. So we have these corpora. They differ on a number of different dimensions, but it allows us to at least start to have a window into how the diversity of experiences of infants in different contexts. Okay, so again, we have a random sample, which means that we just selected randomly from within these long audio recordings. So we ended up with about 30 minutes of sampling per child, and this is not one 30-minute chunk, but a bunch of smaller chunks throughout the day. And the reason that this is a relatively small amount is because all of this was done completely by hand coding. So to give you a sense of why it's so small, it takes about 20 hours of labor, human labor, to get 1 hour of coding from a sample like this. So like Lena, we labeled for things like broad speaker class and who is being talked to. We also have done a lot of transcription of the adult speech and measures of the child's vocal maturity. I won't be presenting those findings today. So first, we just simply asked a numerical question: how much target child-directed speech do the infants hear, and how much adult-directed speech do they hear? So we get about 3.5 minutes per hour of target child-directed speech across the whole sample, a little bit more adult-directed speech, about 10 minutes per hour. And you can see then in both of these cases, the range is quite large. The other thing to note is that there's quite a lot of variation, not just across recordings, but also within a given recording. The speech that these infants are being exposed to is what we call bursty and zero inflated, meaning that it's punctuated, right? We have long periods of silence where there's no speech, punctuated by periods where there's a lot of speech going on. And this makes it a challenge for some kinds of statistical approaches for comparing quantity of speech. We also looked at some other factors. So we looked at whether the amount of speech differed, child-directed speech and adult-directed speech differed by infant age. Was there a developmental effect? In this sample, we didn't see one, although it's a little bit of a small sample to be able to pull out infant age effects. We also did find an effect of the number of people present. And this is an important finding in considering different experiences across communities, because I skimmed over it a little bit, but the number of people in a household varied quite radically from one community to another. So there were some households, for example, that had as many as 14 people in them, which is pretty atypical for a North American family. The other thing that we looked at is who's speaking to these infants. And here I'll show you another busy graph, so I'll break it down for you. You can see that each of these bars, these colored bars, is indicating a different community. And you have, on the far left, you have female adults, in the middle is male adults, and on the right-hand side is other children in the environment who might be speaking to the infant. On the top, we have target child-directed speech, so speech that's actually directed towards the child. And on the bottom is adult-directed speech. So the first thing that I want to get you to notice is that there is more speech more speech coming from women than from males and other children, and this is true pretty much across the board, across the communities. So again, like the previous finding, we're seeing much more speech coming from women, regardless of caregiving practices. The last question that I will speak to at the end of my talk here is how these findings vary across the tested communities. And I want to do this a little bit with some caveats in place, because first of all, in the grand scheme of things, we have a very small sample of cultures that we're comparing here. And they vary on lots of different dimensions, some of which we've measured and some of which we haven't measured. So with respect to cross-cultural variation, our findings here have to be considered very modest, but I'm really excited at where this is heading. So I'm going to show you some of our preliminary findings here. So going back to that graph, I'll just highlight one thing or actually two things, but about one community, the Yala Dene here. And just as a reminder, this community shares a lot of characteristics with the Tseltal Mayan community, but differs in terms of some of its ideas around caregiving. So what you see is that the Yala Dene, you get a lot more adult-directed speech, particularly from the women. And you also get a lot more, here, I'll circle that for you here. And then you also get a lot more speech from other children compared to the other communities here. So how do these findings vary across the tested communities? We do see other variations that I won't get into in terms of who is speaking and to whom that we're looking forward to exploring further. But it's really important to stress, if you're familiar with the WEERD, non-WEERD distinction, that these differences do not fall out neatly across some sort of WEERD, non-WEERD dimension. So it's a helpful term for getting us to think about cultural bias, but it's not really a helpful term for classifying different communities with respect to each other. The other thing to stress is that we see a lot of the next step in these studies is to do some automated analyses across the entire 10,000 plus hours of recordings that we have in these samples. And I'm looking forward to doing that with these new technologies that we're developing. And of course, we really want to expand the metacorpus with some new and to expand the number of communities that we study and expand the diversity of our study. So I'm going to skip my bonus topic because I don't think we have time. So in conclusion, I just want to encourage you to talk to your baby and to everybody else's baby. And just to say that there's some interesting cross-cultural differences that do exist with respect to child-directed speech, but also a lot of similarities as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Super. Thank you so much, Dr. Soderstrom. That's great to know about talking to your baby. We always hear that. Yeah, don't do that. Talk to them like they're grown-ups, but they're not grown-ups. So thank you for that. So we have some questions that have come through during your presentation, and we have the Slido password down there. So feel free to ask as many questions as you like. So Teddy, did you want to put some of the first few questions? Okay. So is there any difference in language learning regarding a mother speaking to an infant and a infant speaking to another infant? What do the infants prefer?
That's a great question. And we can start out by saying, do children actually speak infant-directed speech when they're speaking to other children, and particularly to infants? And the answer appears to be yes. There is, in fact, research showing that even fairly young infants, as young as 4 or younger, use some of the same characteristics that adults do when they're speaking to infants. So it's quite widespread, even across genders and across ages, and who's using this kind of speech. There are some characteristics that especially young children are less good at using, so they tend to be a little bit more controlling in their behaviors when they're speaking to young kids. But like in the larger sense, yes, they do use infant-directed speech.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, this comment came in after you mentioned that 17 countries. Wow, which countries?
I'll have to pull up the slide to remind myself, but we've got and you can go to the website, by the way, ManyBabies.github.io. You can pull up there's an interactive heat map of all of the contributors to the various projects. In ManyBabies 1, we had some Asian countries. We had North America, obviously, about half of them were from North America. We had lots of European countries, and I believe we had Mexico and some Eastern European. I don't remember the exact list off the top of my head, but obviously we had none in Africa. We had none in South America. And our representation in Asia and Eastern Europe could definitely be improved. So
okay, yeah, just see the website there. Yeah, manybabies.github.io. Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, so I encourage everybody to go to that website to learn more. Okay, so some other questions. What other languages are included in the study? But that may have been asked before you got to the languages part. So you mentioned.
Yeah, so I can address that though, and maybe explain why we only used English. It was quite a controversial decision, but we were trying to control the stimuli that were being presented to all of the infants, and we couldn't do that and also vary the language from one laboratory to another. So we ended up going with English because it was the one that was most robustly known to be something that infants prefer. But because of that limitation, we have a follow-up study that we're running right now with a few different languages, including France and the Netherlands and a couple other places, where we're actually re-recording stimuli in their own native languages, and we're going to test those babies, and we're hoping to get a few other contributors as well. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of that follow-up study.
Okay, great, interesting. How does watching television impact the infant learning process? There's so much that we hear on this topic.
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic because screens are such a salient part of our lives right now, especially during the pandemic. So screens are not inherently bad. What's bad about screens is, first of all, that they're not interactive. So, for example, there's some evidence that shows that engaging with, like grandparents engaging with their grandchildren over Skype can be a really meaningful, even linguistically meaningful interaction. And so from that perspective, it's not the screen that's bad. What's bad is that it's not, first of all, it's not interactive. And second of all, it's preventing other kinds of interactions that and experiences that are more beneficial. So, so that's a helpful way to think about it, I think, is that it's preventing the more positive experiences from taking place rather than being itself some sort of harm. I mean, obviously there are some content that you might not want to show a young child or an infant, but the screen itself is not really what's the problem.
Right. Okay. Well, we also hear about, the amount of screen time. Like, is it an hour? Is it 2 hours? Is it 30 minutes? Is it what? And that differs depending on the age of the child, right?
And certainly less is better, but also in these challenging pandemic times. I mean, being a parent is difficult in the best of times, but during pandemic, when kids can't even play with each other, sometimes parents have to do what they have to do, right? And so.
Exactly. So I encourage more questions. There's no other questions at the moment, but that doesn't mean there aren't going to be more questions. I'm just wondering, with this time, because you've got some bonus slides, if we want to go back to that with the extra time, do you want to do that? And that might provide some more questions.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that, Teddy? If you're able to help us there, that would be great.
Okay.
I don't know.
Let's see if I can get back to it. All right, so I just had some bonus slides in case we had a little extra time. This is a study that we published very recently. And this is about a question of what is child-directed speech and how do we perceive it across different cultures and languages. So one reason to ask this question is to think about what is the relationship between child-directed speech and other kinds of ways of talking, like happy talk. And there is research that suggests that there's some sort of a relationship between child-directed speech and happy speech. And in fact, there's some evidence, for example, that what infants are preferring when they prefer infant-directed speech is actually the happiness characteristics of it, at least in part. And there's also some evidence suggesting that infants might be able to recognize the characteristics of child-directed speech across different cultures, even though I haven't really gotten into this, but there's variations across cultures in how we express child-directed speech. So we were interested in looking at this with some speech samples existing speech samples that we had in the lab with English speakers. So could English speakers recognize child-directed speech in other languages? And if so, did they do this because of its relationship to the expression of positive emotions? So we did this with two different speech samples, one a Farsi speech sample, or Persian from Iran, and the other the Tzeltal Mayan samples that we had, that I had already talked about. And I just want to be clear that these were samples that were collected in very different ways. So I have different findings that I'm going to show you, and they shouldn't be compared in that way. This isn't a comparison of Farsi and Tzeltal. So first of all, in the Farsi samples, we did find that the English speakers, adult English speakers, were able to recognize which clips were actually child-directed and which clips were adult-directed with about 82% accuracy. However, and these were given to undergraduates as part of research credit, that kind of sample. But when we did the same thing with the Tzeltal samples, which were much more naturalistic than the Farsi samples, these naive listeners weren't able to detect which ones were the child-directed ones and which ones were the adult-directed ones. However, when we gave those same samples to what I refer to as trained listeners, or actually research assistants in our laboratory who had been working with these kinds of samples in the past, and so had some experience listening to Tzeltal, they did a much better job and were actually able to, at some level of accuracy, discriminate child-directed from adult-directed samples from that culture. So the next question we asked was whether this was related to these English speakers' perception of positive emotion. And one thing to be clear about is that this was the English speakers' perception of positive emotion. We don't actually have the ground truth about what the speaker was actually trying to express. And here you can see that there's, for the Farsi samples, we saw a relationship between the clips that were child-directed as being rated as happier and more loving and more soothing and more exaggerated than the adult-directed samples. But again, that wasn't true of the other sample. The other thing that we did was to look at whether there was a relationship between whether the listeners classified something as being child-directed, so that these graphs are based on whether they actually were child-directed. But we also looked at whether there was a relationship between how they rated the positive emotion of these samples and whether they rated them as child-directed. And we did see some relationship there, but interestingly, not so clear-cut for happy, which was surprising to us because we were expecting that to be one of sort of the most robust relationships, that if it was happy talk, then it would be rated as being child-directed, but that wasn't one of the things that we found.
That's very interesting. So a few questions have come in. Well, one is more of a comment. It's about wonderful data that supports the use of mothers, which is speech language.
Motherese, yeah.
Motherese,
is another term for baby talk. Yeah.
I see, which as speech language pathologists we have promoted. So we have a speech language pathologist who's with us. So that's wonderful to know. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that lovely comment about your presentation.
Oh no, I appreciate it. Yeah, and I think that yeah, I like to be able to. I'm not a speech language pathologist, but I often have these nice interactions, and we learn from each other. So that's nice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, that's good. Okay, and the next question is: were the babies toddler studies did they have their hearing checked, and how does one contact you regarding collaboration?
Well, me personally, you can always email me at m_soderstrom@umanitoba.ca. You can also, if you want to talk to ManyBabies or the ACLU project, you can just go to the website and there's contact information there, or just email me and I'll happily make connections there. I forget what the first part of the question was now, sorry. Was there more to it?
It was were the babies, toddlers studied, did they have their hearing checked?
Yeah, so that's a practice that is varies from laboratory to laboratory. With the ManyBabies study, we didn't require it because it requires some expertise to do properly, and not all laboratories are going to have that expertise. I believe we did have some exclusions if there was a known now I've forgotten. I'll have to go back and look at our data. There was some discussion about whether to exclude infants where there was a known a history of ear infections. I think in the end we didn't do that, just again because we wanted to be consistent in applying those practices across laboratories, and it's just very hard to be consistent about that. But I believe we do have the information about that in our data, which are publicly available, and we'd love to have somebody do a secondary analysis and see if that would matter. Because obviously, yeah, it's an important thing. We did exclude infants who were known to have hearing loss, but we didn't test that ourselves in the study.
So in terms of, I've got a question for you, just in terms of your research, and as you mentioned earlier that you're on research leave. So is it this study that's taking up most of your time, or are there other things that you have on the horizon in this area of your expertise?
Yeah, so right now both of these projects are occupying quite a bit of my time. We do have some other studies in the laboratory. I have a graduate student who's working on looking at maternal depression and how that might affect their use of child-directed speech, and another graduate student who's looking at the use of smartphones and how that impacts language experiences between mothers and babies. I have a graduate student who's just finishing up some work with adolescent mothers and their use of child-directed speech. But beyond that, yeah, so lots of other smaller projects that are ongoing in the lab that my students are primarily pushing forward. But yeah, with ManyBabies, because there's now all of these follow-up studies and some new studies that we're developing, it's keeping us quite busy.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a SSHRT grant that is sort of working towards developing the administrative side of this thing in terms of the partnership between different laboratories and the laboratories and other groups related to developing better science. So I'm looking forward to doing some work there as well.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Great. Well, that all sounds fascinating and much needed research that will impact the relationship between parents and their children. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in this area. Any final comment before our concluding remarks? Anything you wanted to say?
No, I appreciate your giving me the time to speak. Yeah, I'd love to hear from people if they want to email me directly and have further questions or comments.
Perfect. So her email is there. So if you're wanting to touch base or get more information on her research, thank you so much, Dr. Soderstrom, for making yourself available in that way and for presenting today. Was really, really interesting. And thank you to everybody, all of you who were listening and viewing today's session. We will be sending you a link to today's session as well as to a survey where you can share your thoughts and your feedback, including other suggestions for topics and speakers. We really encourage you to respond. It's the only way that we're able to improve and also to know what sorts of topics and speakers that you're interested in. So in terms of the remaining virtual learning for life sessions for this fall, we're going to need to take a very agile approach, and we will keep you updated from week to week, whether there will in fact be a presentation during this period of the strike. There will for sure not be a presentation next week, which is November the 10th, but for the remaining sessions, we will keep you updated. And if they are deferred, we will look at alternative dates with our faculty members after the strike. So please keep watch of your inboxes for news about the Virtual Learning for Life program. We really appreciate your flexibility and your understanding during this time. And if you have any questions about this or other programming, please email our Alumni Relations Unit at alumni@umanitoba.ca. So thank you again for participating today, and we will see you soon.